Welcome to the Tech Humanist Show, a multimedia format program exploring how data and technology shape the human experience. I'm your host, Kate O'Neill.
In the overall system, the tech does not replace the human. The tech challenges the human to do something different in interaction with it. And so the question is, how do we rethink the role of the human? Because humans aren't going away. They're going to be needed even more. It's just a question of what are those human skills that we're going to need going into the future.
That was Wendy K. Smith, the Dana J. Johnson Professor of Management at the University of Delaware and a leading expert on strategic paradoxes. Wendy's groundbreaking work and her book, Both and Thinking, Embracing Creative Tensions to Solve Your Toughest Problems, challenges leaders to embrace complexity and find creative solutions to seemingly conflicting demands. Her insights on balancing technological advancement with human-centric approaches are particularly relevant for our increasingly complex business environment. All right, Wendy Smith. Hey, your work focuses on both and thinking and paradoxes, right? So how can that approach help tech leaders? Like what should tech leaders be thinking about when it comes to that both and mindset? What do you think in terms of innovation and human centricity? Where does that take you when you think about that?
Well, Kate, it's funny because I started this research in the realm of innovation and tech, and in part because that is the space where the either or comes in all the time. It feels like in order to move to the future, we got to let go of the past. And that is not the case. And in fact, the leaders that do this innovation thing best reject the either or and figure out how to live into the both and. How do I both honor where I am today and all of the things that I know and do, and switch, change, innovate, experiment for the future? Right now and that's hard. I just wanted to empathize. That is hard. Yeah. It's hard to live into both of these. And we can talk about this in this moment that we are in right now. We're in the midst, as you talk about, the next massive technological revolution. And unless leaders can live into the both and in that, there's going to be a lot of leaders and companies left behind.
Yeah. Yeah. The AI moment and the emerging technology that's driving automation, I think a lot of people feel the dehumanization of that. I wonder how we can embrace, though, not just in the spirit of sort of philosophically being, techno solutionists and saying like, oh, yes, of course, we're going to embrace tech because it's technology. And why wouldn't we embrace technology? But in terms of the actual opportunity that's there, in terms of the way that we could reframe our thinking and bring true leadership to the decision making we're doing, how could organizations embrace paradoxical thinking in this way? What good can paradoxical thinking offer in that context?
Well, let's just start with why it is what we tend to do and why that's a problem. So in order to get ourselves to paradoxical thinking in the both and, we have to understand the baseline, which is when we are confronted with strategic challenges, problems, issues, what have you, we frame them. They show up for us as trade-offs, as dilemmas in which we have to make a choice, as an either or. That's the way we tend to confront issues. And that's the way our brains tend to work. And so that is the case if there is all this new technology, let's say AI, and instead of saying, well, how does AI complement, work synergistically, expand, enhance what we do? The first thing we think is, well, how is it going to take over what we do and get rid of what we do? So if we're thinking about this challenge of the future versus the present, because they feel contradictory, oppositional, in tension with each other, we assume that tension means that we have to choose between the two. It's either we move into the future or we experience the present. And by the way, let's talk about the other experience that we have as we experience innovation, which is that are we excited about it or are we fearful about it? Well, friends, a little bit, it's not one or the other here, but we feel like these things are two different stances. What kind of stance do we have? And we feel like we have to lean into, or we feel like it's a choice. Either I am a techno enthusiast and leaning in with excitement or I am a technophobe and, putting all these brakes and fears and restrictions. And so we tend to frame all of the problems that we do in the world. And by the way, this is not just a framework for innovation. We talk about this as a framework for life. But we tend to experience challenges as a trade-off, as an either or. And that is where the problem lies. And if we are to where the solution is, we're going to jump there. And I'm happy to talk about why we do that and why it's a problem. But the solution is noticing how quickly we frame a problem as an either or, seeing that we could reframe the problem and seeing the possibility in that reframe.
Yeah, that's powerful. I think that's what first impressed me about your work when I became aware of it. First of all, the concept of both and that construct has been so important in my life and in the way that I approach problem solving myself. And it's part of almost every meaningful model that I've developed, like this way of bringing contradiction into it. Strategic optimism, which I introduced in A Future So Bright, and in what matters next, the book that's coming out in January, the through line thinking and the now next continuum, they're very much about thinking about, like you say, the present and the future as not contradictory, but a continuum, and something that helps us understand decision making in that lens. But I'm thinking, like, what let us go ahead and back up. And you said let's unpack why this is so important and why it benefits us to think about the contradictions and how that helps us see things more clearly.
Yeah. And Kate, one of the reasons I'm so excited to be in conversation with you, I'm looking forward I would love to hear more, is how much you use this as a frame. For some people, this is really natural. For most people, for most of us, it's not. And in fact, the reason I started studying both and was because, as we say in the world of psychology and social sciences, research is me search. I was stuck in these either ors. And so I was trying to figure out my own decision making and thinking around this. And that's the case for most people. And so to your point, or to your question, most of the time when we confront an issue, our brains see very quickly what the opposite, the opposing pressures, the differences, the opposition between different options. We go to and see those distinctions as the first order of thinking. And when we see these distinctions and see the ways in which they are in conflict with each other. So just to put some meat around that, we might have a decision. When I do workshops and I tell people, tell me an issue you have at work, the number one issue that will come up for people is work-life balance, which I always laugh at. Companies bring me in to talk about how they could better adjust their work and what their people are telling. Well, actually, it's not the issue that I have at work. It's my issue with work. And so, I want to address work-life balance. Well, work-life balance feels like a dilemma or tension because it's vying and competing for our time, for our energy, for our resources. Am I going to spend this evening with my family, or am I going to spend it finishing a project? Am I going to, so it really feels to us like we have to make choices between them because these opposing demands are asking us to do two very different things. What we find is that tempting, and by the way, it's scary. It's scary to sort of live into a world where there's these opposing things and they reinforce each other, because there's a lot of uncertainty involved in that. And what we like as a human species is we like to see different options. We like to pick one. We like to justify. We like to be consistent. We like clarity. And living into a world where there's this holistic interdependence between opposing ideas, even saying that feels complex. It feels uncertain. It feels ambiguous. Those are all things that we as human beings don't like, don't want. We prefer not to have that. And so we tend to lean back into that either or state. Well, what we find is that doing that, we argue it's limited at best and it's detrimental at worst. It's limited because there's better solutions out there when you can apply both and thinking. It's detrimental because by living into the either or, what we tend to do is believe that if we pick a side, if we see an issue or a challenge, if we pick a side, if we believe that we're right in the side, then that either or thinking means that the other side has to be wrong. That leads
Yeah.
into this kind of polarizing, almost aggressive, competitive approach that becomes problematic in organizations. And it is certainly becoming problematic, and not becoming, is problematic in broader systems, in our countries, in our politics, for not being able to come up with better solutions.
Right, right. Where it feels like there are no ways to integrate those kinds of needs, like needs that represent different priorities and different viewpoints on what the highest priority problems in society are. But in a business too, what's an example of a company or a leadership role that you've seen adopt this approach and maybe transform the way that they approached problem solving or something that was going on inside their organization?
One of my favorite companies, one that we write about in our book and that I've followed for quite some time, is Unilever under the leadership of Paul Pullman. You're nodding your head. It's a story that I think is a well-known story, particularly for people who study sustainability or study this broader question of how companies think about a broader set of agendas, not just their financial bottom line. And very briefly, for those that don't know the story, Unilever is a packaged goods company headquartered in the UK and in the Netherlands. They own all kinds of products like Lipton tea and Ben and Jerry's. In around the 2008 financial crisis, they were in a death spiral, in part due to an excessive amount of acquisitions and due to mismanagement. Paul Pullman comes in to explore what he can do. And what I love is in his book with Andrew Winston, he says, like, it was so problematic that we didn't even use our own product. We didn't even sell our own products in our own cafeteria. We were selling the competitors' products there. Just a real challenge. And this was an organization around for over 100 years. He made a commitment that he was going to turn the organization around and double profits, not adjacent to, not in spite of, but through a commitment to reducing their environmental footprint by a half and impacting people around the world, the social and well-being of people around the world, doubling their impact on people around the world. So that raised all kinds of tensions for them. So first of all, I want to notice that his strategic commitment was to living into both a financial bottom line alongside and through an integration with social and environmental well-being. Now that raises all kinds of tensions for him. And the question is, how does he navigate that? And what I loved is when we interviewed him, he said, well, of course, this is going to raise all kinds of tensions. Importantly, what we are going to do as a company is not frame those tensions as problems or issues that need to go away, but as opportunities for us to grow and learn and do something new and more creative. And that became super important for him.
That's such a wonderful example too, and I love Unilever. You're right when you said the name of the company and his name, Paul Pullman. I was like, oh, that's a very familiar example to me because it has been such a great case study to cite in my own work. But I do think there are plenty of people who are probably listening to this discussion and who are not as familiar with Paul Pullman and Unilever's their leadership. So I encourage you to definitely read Both and Thinking and look for that example. But I also wonder too, you talk about his commitment to sustainability and to the right practices within that profitability. I'm wondering too, I think as I recall, there was a commitment to the people of the organization and making sure that, they reduced inequity and that sort of thing. I wonder if you have other examples or if you have other insights to share about adopting Both and Thinking specifically as it relates to the future of work and human resources, thinking about, balancing the benefits of automation, say, with the need to develop and value human skills. How do we think about those seemingly competing demands in a both and way and embrace paradoxical thinking for progress?
Yeah, I love that. I remember when I was going through grad school, and I was getting my PhD, the quintessential example of an organization that knew how to do this was Southwest Airlines. They were known for Herb Kelleher, CEO, along with Colleen Barrett, COO, known for how they advanced and put people first in service, knowing that if they did that, that would then be in service of ensuring that their customers had a great experience. And they had a whole plan around what does it look like for us to put people first, and how will that have an impact on our bottom line? And I think that that's as we move into the next wave of automation. One of we see this again and again, which is that automation is really a scary word for people because it means that some people's jobs will go away to the robotic, computers that will do that work. And what we have seen from organizations is that organizations that do this well know how to reskill and retool and re-engage people. Yeah, some people's jobs will go away. One question for organizations is what are they going to do to rethink the role? People won't go away. The need for people won't go away. The question is, how do we use people in a different way? And by the way, if individuals are listening to this and they're thinking, oh my gosh, my job can be done more efficiently by a robot, then the question is for them, how do you start retooling and reskilling yourself? Because in the overall system, and Kate, this is, I'm curious to hear what you have to say about this, but you know this best. In the overall system, the tech does not replace the human. The tech challenges the human to do something different in interaction with it. And so the question is, how do we rethink the role of the human? Because humans aren't going away. They're going to be needed even more. It's just a question of what are those human skills that we're going to need going into the future.
Yeah, and I think it's a discussion that has to do with agency and empowerment as well. It's, you're making such a valid point for individuals listening and thinking about their own job security and their own job functions, that there's an opportunity to be proactive and to embrace that sense of agency to say, well, how can I, adopt automation within my own scope of work and make myself more efficient and make myself more valuable. But of course, many people don't necessarily have that capability within their purview, and they don't necessarily have access to the tools at their disposal to make themselves more efficient. And mostly what we discuss, the context of what we're discussing here in this, with our listenership, tends to be more around management decision and company leadership. So I think what we're called upon to consider is, how do we make these decisions? How do we lead companies through these evolutionary cycles in ways that are responsible, that we know we are growing into a more profitable company, we're becoming more effective, and we're empowering people where we can, with the opportunity to lean into that growth.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I remember, again, this was back in somehow you're drawing on all of my early research days. As part of my dissertation, I mostly studied IBM and the technology revolution as they moved into what we now know as cloud computing and that transition in the early 2000s. I also studied at that time a handful of media companies, mostly newspapers, and as they were moving into online news. And one thing that happens in all of these technology revolutions is that you have people for whom they are so embedded in the skills of how you do things that they're just going to resist and reject and hesitate along the way for the new skills. And so companies have to be thoughtful. Well, where am I going strategically, and who are the people that I need to bring along or not bring along? And I remember just so clearly in one newspaper, one major city newspaper, and I was interviewing folks. It was very clear who were the journalists that were in the newsroom that had been there for years. They were still wearing suits and ties. They were coming into work with a briefcase. They were working in the office, putting the paper to bed each night with a deadline. and they didn't understand or couldn't connect to, both in terms of the skills, but also in terms of the identity and the enthusiasm of the folks that were coming in ripped jeans and, tie-dye t-shirts, and we're sitting on a very different floor, because these were the guys that were doing the news that was like not putting the paper to bed each night, but we're putting the paper to bed every minute in the online news world. And so, to be clear, like, the part of what we see with people is not just that the skills are different, but there's an identity challenge. There's a challenge in terms of, like, there's that gut fear. Am I going to be valuable anymore? Here I've built up my whole career, but I'm not going to be valuable anymore. And so I think that's right. And so I guess I do think that this is a problem at both the managerial level and the individual level. At the managerial level, how do we create the conditions where we can enable some of those people to really lean into the new skills? And at the individual level, what does it take for you to do so? Now, if you're at the end of your career, it might not be the time and place to do so. But if you're not, then the question is, are you willing to learn, grow? Carol Dweck, have a growth mindset? Because if you're not, then we can go back to what Collins and Porras said, however many years ago in Good to Great or Built to Last, which is that if you're going to transition as an organization, there will be a group of people that aren't going to come along no matter how often you invite them. And at some point, you got to kick them off the bus. Like, you just can't have your organization weighed down by them. So I do think I have both empathy for and interest in leaders of organizations making the conditions where they can bring those people along. But if they and this is an and, those people have to, the employees, we all have to lean into how to, try new things. I'll just say one more thing, because
sure,
I am like, I'm not an early adopter of tech. I'll just say that it's not my, I am so grateful to people like you who are. I'm not. And so AI feels like a little bit out of my realm. And I realize that unless I understand that, like, this is happening whether I like it or not. So I could either sit in the corner and be grumpy about it, or I can jump in and start playing and experimenting at the level of which I'm comfortable. That's a question and a choice that I have to make. And so the invitation, is what the challenge I put to myself over the last couple of weeks is, what does it take for me to just experiment with this kind of technology in a way that is low stakes, so that I can start understanding what it is that I am afraid of, and at least find some comfort in my discomfort and still be able to move forward? That's an invitation for people.
Yeah. No, that's wonderful. I think that is something that I think many, we have a canine answer
We do.
to that.
He
We
has
have
a lot to say about this too,
the
actually.
tech canonist is going to be a part of the discussion. um, I love that answer, though. I think it's really important to acknowledge the reality that, not everybody is excited about emerging technology, right? And even if you make it possible for people to come along, that not everybody's going to be eager to adopt the new changes in their workflow or their job description. So that's a balance.
I want to throw in another both and. I could be unexcited and experimental at the same time. I don't have to be, and this is where I'm playing, at least in this space at the moment, or empathizing, which is that I'm not a tech enthusiast. I'm not your early adopter, as I was saying, but I feel a lot of fear and anxiety about AI. And at the same time, I'm going to experiment with it. So I think that's right. And I think that I want to empathize for the people for whom this is not easy to access the technology, or it's not comfortable to engage with it. And it's here, it's coming.
I'm going to do a tally at the end of this in the transcript of how many times we say the word and. I'm sure it's going to be more than any other episode, as it should be. It's perfect.
Kate, when our book came out, which is called Both And, we wanted to just call it And. And
a
brilliant publisher said to us, that's not good for search engine optimization. And we're like, okay, we get it. But indeed, we just live in the and.
Yeah, someone just told me about a product that they were launching that had just a one word. It's a very common word name. And I'm like, oh, that's going to be a lot of fun with your SEO. But even both and seems like it's probably a little bit of a challenge.
Yeah.
I wanted to switch gears just a little bit, because I know that one of your roles is is in your involvement with the Women's Leadership Initiative. Is that right? Still, and I wanted to ask you about that because it also it feels like a couple of things may be true or worth unpacking here. One is that it may be easier to ascribe both and or kind of out of the box thinking to women leaders, and I think there may be reasons that I could hypothesize about that, but for whatever reasons, socialized or otherwise, that women may come to these types of approaches more readily than men in leadership roles. But I wonder, as a corollary to that possible observation, what can we do to make the way easier for women to move into leadership roles where this approach is helping them, lift up and support organizations and bring that thinking along into the organization as a whole? And because I couldn't have done it without an and in the question, what can we do to make to make the idea more readily accessible to male leaders who may not see the opportunity as readily, who may not struggle with the opportunity, the space that this thinking provides? Is that something that you've encountered, and how do we go about that?
Yeah, I love that hypothesis. That's my hypothesis too. And here's the deal. We have yet to find the evidence for that. And we've looked because I have that same hypothesis. I have a colleague that I was at Harvard Business School with, Anita Woolley. She is currently at Carnegie Mellon. They have some research that shows that women tend to have more associative thinking. That kind of thinking helps if you have that on a team. It helps bring together the diverse points of view. And so with my colleagues, we created a paradox mindset inventory. It's out there in the world. Anyone can take it. You can find it on my website and other places. And that inventory, which now has been taken by thousands of people, looks at the extent to which people have greater comfort with, the extent to which they experience tensions more often. Some of us are turning a blind eye, if you will, trying to avoid them. Some of us just don't experience a lot of tensions. But the extent to which they experience tensions more often and are willing to adopt a both and approach. And so we have this paradox mindset inventory. Thousands of people have taken it. I keep looking and I keep saying to my colleagues, let's keep looking, because I'm sure there has to be a gender difference. There's just all this research about women being more collaborative, associative, able to pull from different strands and bring it together. And we have not yet found it. So either
fascinating.
I don't give our and I want to just go on the book here. I'm going to give our male colleagues so much more credit that they are much more associative than they were giving them credit for. But it has not come up yet in our data that we see a difference there in terms of gender. Now that said, what we do know is that when women step into leadership positions, there are sort of unique tensions that they have to grapple with, we have to grapple with in leadership roles, in part because the expectations, and there's a huge body of research around this, the expectations and the way that people have stereotypes and expectations of leadership are defined by very male characteristics and often contradictory to what women bring to the table. So women face this ongoing tension between either call it compassion and competence, or Alison Fraggle's new book that looks at the both and, she calls it being a likable badass, and makes the argument that you don't have to be likable or a badass, you can do both. But I think that is a particular leadership challenge that women confront because of the stereotypes that we have about women and the stereotypes that we have about leadership. And I do think that that's one of these both ands that I would invite women to step into. What does it take to be a likable badass? And that's there is a set of leadership competencies that women need to develop in order to lean into both.
Yeah, and it also
do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it sounds like an opportunity to think about Paul Pullman as a model for male leaders or any leader to embrace the both andness of the challenge he set before himself and before the company when he took over, to be able to say, I'm going to be both an empathetic leader and an effective one. I'm going to make sure we grow this company, and we're going to do it in ways that value the human contribution and the sustainability
Yeah.
of our contribution.
It turns out that our book has a lot of female leaders. In
Yeah.
part as, and I can't tell if that's a selection bias of women that we just resonated with. We feature Terry Kelly, who was the CEO of W.L. Gore and Company. We feature Janet Perna, who was one of the fabulous leaders that I interviewed for my PhD dissertation at IBM, who led the database management transition at IBM. We feature Zita Cobb, who's this incredible, if you have any Canadians who are listening, an incredible Canadian leader that started an amazing organization, or was the third highest paid female executive in Canada, cashed out and started this amazing organization in Fogo Island. So there are a number of female leaders that are in the book. And we have some really great male leaders. We have people like Paul Pullman. We have a friend and colleague, Jeremy Hawkinstein, who started an incredible social enterprise called Digital Divide Data that looks to create work opportunities and training in countries where there's limited training opportunities through work engagement. So yeah, I don't know what to say about the gender piece. Maybe more to come. Maybe we should come back to this in a couple of years and see if we've landed on a more cohesive argument about gender.
Yeah, I'll be looking forward to additional insights on that. It's important to me to get to the bottom of that, partly because the majority of the people who have been early champions of the work I do at KO Insights and through Tech Humanist Show and the sort of auxiliary brands have been mostly male leaders, and it's very encouraging to me that there have been so many who have seen the vision of that both and approach to saying, how can we move forward in the most aggressive way with the technologies that are going to help us be competitive and be innovative in the marketplace, and not break the human experience while we're doing it. How can we be sure we're creating better customer experiences, user experiences, patient experiences, whatever the case may be. But that clarity, and this is moving beyond gender, just into leadership and that embrace of the both andness of that thinking. I think one of the things, sorry, okay. I was just going to say one thing that I do see as a possibility for the gender discussion is that the terminology may just be different. Like, I think that there's within sort of future ready discussion and the tech space, the word complexity, or the idea of complexity is sort of this it's an aspirational idea. Like, if we embrace complexity within technology and future thinking, then we're preparing ourselves for to get past uncertainty and be ready for whatever comes our way. That feels like that's marketed well to male leaders and not as much to female leaders. So I'll be very curious to see if that shows up in your research.
Well, I was actually, I love that. I mean, I was going to say, like, I think of your space, the tech savvy, the humanist, the human savvy technologist, as a huge both and. In my world, the both and means it's not just that you have to have both, but that there are ways in which human competencies advance and enable the technology, and technology advances and enables human well-being or welfare. And I'm curious how you see it, how that comes up, and where people are doing that well, in which they're leaning into that synergy, or where they're not.
Yeah, one of the things that struck me about one of the comments you were making earlier was, and I forget which answer it was, but there was something about the way you were answering it that made me think about this idea of like folding over what seemed like opposing ideas so that you're looking almost through them together. That was one sort of visualization that was coming to me. And that's one of the ways that I think you could think about this tech and human space, is that very often I think people see them as being, like arms that reach away from some central idea and they're in opposition to one another, as opposed to looking through them simultaneously at the collected opportunity that they represent. Like, how can we actually solve for human problems at scale with the capacity and expanded opportunity that technology affords us? How can we be sure we're using that framing? And at the same time, if we're going to be enthusiastic about technology, if we're going to say like, hey, I'm just excited about tech, I'd like to see us experiment with tech because it's there, then being sure we're doing that with the mindset of, yeah, cool. And let's make sure that we also are keeping in check with that, what it means to do that in a world that is populated by humans and other living beings, and that, you know, is consistent with a thriving planet, and, you know, looks toward future generations, and so on. So that the and really feels like it does a lot of work there. But
Yeah.
it is an important observation, I think. That did you ever come up with a way to think about the visualization of these ideas?
Yeah. Well, yes, Anne. Uh, so I was gonna, well, let me start with, because one of the things that really struck me was we have some language around a framework about what would it take to live into the both and.
Mhm.
And I feel like you just gave us the example of what that looks like. And I want to just put some language around what you just said, in part because we talk about three sort of steps to structurally to think about the both and. The first is, what's the bigger picture? We talk about it as a higher purpose and overarching vision
Mhm.
that accommodates both competing demands, and how do we hold that, right? So in the tech space, you know, and it might be we're trying to advance the well-being of the world, and how does tech, and then the question is, okay, that's a big motivational statement and requires both technology and human interaction in order to make that happen. So if we go back to Paul Pullman, he knew from the very beginning that in order to embrace this both and in his company, he needed a really inspiring vision statement, mission statement for Unilever. And for them, it's making sustainable living everyday sustainable living. We're going to make sustainable living every day, every place. And that required them to think about their sustainability and their bottom line, and both had to come into that statement. So the overarching point of view, the second that we talk about is what we say is separate and connect, the practices of, if we're going to find the integration between these opposing ideas, we have to start by pulling them apart and
Mhm.
understanding what each are valuable for. So in the tech humanist space, what is it that tech can do? What's its value? What's it enabling? What is it about the humans that's unique, distinct,
Mhm.
valuable, different from the tech, so that we can value each of these pieces in service of finding the connection? So when we say separate, it's pull apart, understand each of these pieces, value each of them. You know, and again, for Paul Pullman, it's, what is it that I need for my bottom line? Why, how, what are the components? What are the processes, goals, structure? What are my goals, processes, structures, outcomes that I'm looking for my social and environmental goals? Let me pull them apart. Who needs to lead each of these to put some focus on them in service of finding those connections? And then the third piece, and I think you articulated this so brilliantly, is we have to have some guardrails. It's really easy in the space of trying to both and to flop far to one degree or the other. What are the guardrails we are going to create to prevent us from going too far? How do we prevent the guardrails? How does Paul Pullman create the roles and people and structures to prevent from going so far into the social environmental realm that the bottom line suffers? And how do you create the guardrails in terms of goals and structures and roles and people to prevent from going so far into the financial realm? So what are the guardrails to prevent both of those? So I think those processes help us to break down. Okay, we're going to say we do both and, but it's not and there's more. We've got to make some clear choices, but how do we do that?
That's so useful, because I think many people can relate to the idea of using something like balanced scorecard, or, you know, an integrated view of the organization, and how metrics can be, you know, supplementary to one another. Like, we know we're looking toward this, but also, you know, we don't want to see that go down, and so we're looking at that dial and that dashboard and so on. But I think what you just articulated is so effective at helping us understand the holism of that, you know, the synergy of those kinds of metrics and how those can support one another. Have you seen approaches in organizations that have you done that particularly well when it comes to metrics and measurement?
Well, I think balanced scorecard is a great example, because
Mm-hmm.
that was an early statement of, there's multiple, the key idea here is there's multiple metrics, and we've got to be in this ongoing dynamic world of maximizing across these multiple metrics and make choices that enable that. One of the metaphors that we use for that is we talk about it as tightrope walking in terms of strategic decision making, and here's why that became important, or where that came from. When people talk about both and, I think there is, or certainly I came into the idea of both and as assuming that if you bring competing ideas together, you will always find this creative integration, this better, stronger, more effective outcome. And when I was studying, as I said, when I was doing my dissertation, and this idea was the core of my dissertation, and I was studying leaders at IBM and how they were managing this tech revolution, what I assumed was that they would separate and connect. They would pull apart what they were doing today, their existing customers and processes, and what they were doing tomorrow, their innovation and R&D. And then they would find all of these great places in their sales and in their R&D where there was this like big win-win creative integration between the two. And I was expecting a lot of that. And that happens and happened sometimes. There were moments where, for example, they could be able to dispatch their existing sales team to sell the new product and then bring that back to bring people along to the existing product, or to sell the new product to all their existing clients. And there was this win-win in bringing those together. And that does happen. And we call that the mule. And we call it the mule because the mule is the oldest biological hybrid that we've been breeding for like 3,000 years, which is the hybrid between, smarter than the donkey, stronger than the horse. You bring the horse and donkey together and you've got the smarter, stronger mule. But that didn't happen a lot when I was studying these leaders in business. Instead, what I found that they were doing was that overall, they were committing to these competing strategic priorities, that in that case, the today and tomorrow innovation in an existing product. And what they were doing on a daily basis or on a weekly basis was making these strategic decisions that oscillated between investing in each one, sort of like the balanced scorecard, these multiple different levers, and we're sort of shifting around between these different needs. And so when I would sit in on these senior leadership meetings, sometimes they'd say, okay, we now need to move more engineers over to make sure that we respond to this particular customer's immediate request, but then we're going to move these engineers over to make sure that they're, we're just moving resources on an ongoing basis in a more dynamic way. And we call that tightrope walking as an approach because essentially what leaders are doing in their strategic thinking is that they are in the big picture, the overarching big picture framework, committing to both competing demands, but then they're not stuck and flip-flopping between them and going nowhere. They are moving forward, but they're moving forward on this very narrow tightrope. And to move forward, they're never balanced. They're always making these sort of tweaking, balancing decisions between the two, but they're not making these over-committed decisions where in some of the leaders that I spoke to, they were so focused on their existing product that they couldn't shift and move and focus on the innovation, and they would sort of fall off the tightrope. So it's this tightrope walking where you're making these balancing, oscillating shifts right and left in order to move forward. That's the kind of decision-making we see a lot in the both and worlds.
I think it's such an important observation because I think it'll resonate a lot with our listeners who are in organizations that struggle with these kind of seemingly competing demands of like buy versus build in software, or centralization versus decentralization when it comes to organizational structure, or those kinds of things. And it seems like what you've articulated there is an acknowledgement that there can be these multiple things that have validity, right? Like your approach going with buy is not wrong or build is not wrong. But there's probably not, and I think it circles right back around to an observation you made early on about the polarization, because I think so often an organization looks at one or other of those decisions and goes like, oh, that's our identity now. We're a buy company, not a build company, or we're a centralized company, not a decentralized company, instead of looking at that opportunity for that tightrope walking that you're describing and saying like, maybe there's an opportunity to find our right place in between those priorities or those decisions and make the right choice for us today, and then the right choice tomorrow, and the right choice the next day that might be different.
Yeah, and I want to make a sort of nuanced distinction, lest to offer a sort of finer point on this. What we find is that one of the problems with the either or is that we lean to one side. And then when that doesn't work, we swing to the other side. We're a buy company. Oh my gosh, we have overbought and we are so like the number of M&A and acquisitions that we have done and we can't integrate them and da 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 da. And we're just going to like shut down all acquiring and move.
Right.
So we call that one of those as the pattern of a wrecking ball, where one of the problems with either or is we swing too far to one direction. When it doesn't go well, we just overcorrect in the other direction. And we see this in companies all the time. We see this in our politics. We swing between, our politics, or we swing from a company that is super collaborative. And then we realize we're all so nice to each other, but we're not getting any work done. So like super independent.
Shut it down. Yeah.
and those swings are not effective. So that's not the tightrope walking. The tightrope walking is a more complex commitment to these competing demands and living into them holistically, where we're making these micro oscillations to accommodate both along the way. There are some buy decisions, there's some build decisions, and asking the question, how do they reinforce one another? Not just sit side by side. How do we use them to reinforce one another?
Yes, I'm glad you made that distinction. I think it's a very important subtlety to what you're talking about, and one that I hope will actually be articulated within What Matters Next. I cannot wait for you to see that, and I'm looking forward to digging more into your work. When we move toward wrapping up here and some final thoughts, what advice or what kind of takeaway would you give to our listeners as tech professionals, as leaders, and just enthusiasts of business and tech thought on how they can apply both and thinking in their professional work, their daily decision-making processes, but also in their daily lives?
Yeah. I love the daily life question. One of my favorite moments was doing a keynote for a large tech company. And a lot of engineers tend to be, if there's a lot of tech people here, engineers tend to be trained to be very linear, input, throughput, output, mean orientation, average mean orientation. And so I love talking to engineers because it's sort of a light bulb moment. That while that could be useful for some process thinking, it might not be useful for all of our strategic thinking. And at this talk, one of the guys came up to me at the break and said, "Oh my gosh, Wendy, you just helped me out with the challenges I'm having with my ex-wife." And so,
wow.
Sometimes I feel like I'm doing marital therapy, because indeed, partnering and parenting and relationships, the tightly we hold to a position and not accommodate others, the harder it is for us to be in relationship with other people. This is there's a relational component to this too. So I love that. I think one of the things that I experience in both anding is that this is a lifelong commitment to a mindset and approach along the way. It's complex. There are emotional components. In the book, we talk about a key piece of navigating the emotions around this, the defensiveness, the fears, the anxieties, and being able to acknowledge that. But I think that even amid that complexity, one of the things that I find is that there's an entryway in, and the entryway into thinking about this is noticing how often we frame issues as an either or, just pausing to notice that and inviting ourselves or inviting our colleagues or others to just change the question from should we do X or Y to how can we accommodate X and Y? And we like to cite the psychologist Paul Watzlawick, who says the problem is not the problem. The problem is the way we think about the problem. And what I find in my own work, it's almost there we go. It's a bit of a professional hazard that when someone says, well, Wendy, A or B, and my gut reaction is, well, how can we do A and B? And it's not always an easy answer to that, but just changing the question invites us into, or noticing that we're saying A or B, and then changing the question invites us into a different way of thinking.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for spending this time here today. I will provide a wrap up in the show notes and some places where people can look for additional information about you. But where's the main place that people can find you and connect with you?
We probably the consolidated place is our website, bothandthinking.net. And that has links to, links to our social media and links to our newsletter. Our newsletter is called It's Not an Either Or, because I just found that was a mantra that I would say so often. So people can follow us in that conversation and add to that as well.
Bothandthinking.net, and you'll want to sign up for that newsletter. I'm totally sure everybody's going to be right there on it. Thank you so much, Wendy. I appreciate you being here. Thank you for listening to the Tech Humanist Show. This episode was produced and edited by Thrive Loud Productions, with research by Ashley Robinson and Aaron Daughtry of Interrobang. You can find more information about the show's guests and links to their projects at thetechhumanist.com, where you can also find more episodes, or you can subscribe at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Special thanks to all of our guests for lending their voices to help make the future a brighter place. I'm Kate O'Neill. You've been listening to the Tech Humanist Show from KO Insights.